Vice-Admiral Maximilian von Spee, commander of Germany's last naval squadron outside Europe, had just given the Royal Navy its worst defeat in over a century. Off the coast of Chile at Coronel, his cruisers sent 1,600 British sailors to the bottom without losing a single man. Now, in the South Atlantic waters near the Falkland Islands in December 1914, Spee steered toward what intelligence promised would be an easy final prize. But as the harbor came into focus through his binoculars, von Spee's confidence shattered. Instead of a sleepy British coaling station, he saw tall masts towering over armored hulls, battlecruisers with their gun turrets already turning toward his ships. It appeared to be a trap. As to why Spee did what he did next, even the German Kaiser Wilhelm II would later write that it was a mystery. Oceans at war. When a .380 caliber bullet struck down the Archduke on Sarajevo streets on June 28, 1914, few expected the dominoes to fall as they did. By August, Europe's tangled alliances had dragged half the world into conflict. Britain, with its sprawling empire and maritime might, found itself eyeball to eyeball with Germany, whose Kaiser had spent decades building a fleet specifically to challenge Britannia's rule of the waves. The clash of dreadnoughts in the North Sea that many predicted never materialized. Instead, the war at sea scattered into 1,000 smaller confrontations across the globe's oceans. Germany's overseas squadrons, stationed from China to Africa to the Pacific, suddenly found themselves hunted, isolated, and fuel-starved. None faced this predicament with more calculated resolve than Vice-Admiral Maximilian von Spee. Born in Copenhagen in 1861 and raised in the Rhineland, Maximilian von Spee joined the Imperial Navy at 17. He served in Africa and China, survived rheumatic fever, and steadily climbed the ranks. By 1912, he commanded the East Asia Squadron, flying his flag aboard Scharnhorst, a cruiser that twice won the Kaiser's gunnery prize. Spee was tall, impeccably disciplined, and ran his fleet with Prussian precision. His officers were fiercely loyal, his crews superbly trained. Touring Asia and the Pacific, he built a reputation for calm authority. When war came in 1914, he was far from home, but ready for battle. Across the ocean, Britain deployed Rear Admiral Christopher Craddock, a decorated veteran of British colonial campaigns. His sharp blue eyes and reputation for swashbuckling gallantry masked a thoughtful tactician. Sir Christopher Craddock had spent decades at sea, from the Red Sea to China, from royal duty to daring rescues. Decorated, respected, and loyal to the traditions of the Royal Navy, he'd earned a reputation for courage and unflinching resolve. In early 1914, Craddock was commanding the 4th Cruiser Squadron in the Americas, enforcing British interests during the Mexican Revolution. When war broke out in Europe, he was ordered south to confront the German East Asia Squadron. Yet the Admiralty had saddled him with aging ships and inexperienced crews. Craddock had written passionately about naval strategy, but theories couldn't compensate for outclassed vessels. Waiting in the wings was Vice-Admiral Dubton Sturdy, the Admiralty's Chief of Staff. Cold, calculating, and politically astute, Sturdy had risen through the ranks on technical brilliance rather than battlefield glory. His meticulous planning had helped shape Britain's naval deployment at war's outset. As summer turned to autumn in 1914, these three men, Spee, Craddock, and Sturdy, were set on collision courses that would determine the fate of nations and empires in the storm-tossed waters of the South Atlantic. The Hunter and the Hunted. Craddock had been handed a mission with no margin for error, yet the Admiralty had given him both error and confusion in abundance. As autumn storms lashed Europe's trenches, Vice-Admiral Maximilian von Spee's East Asia Squadron had vanished from the Pacific, while British forces snatched up German colonial possessions, Samoa, Nauru, Yap. Spee had quietly slipped away from Tsingtao. In early October, wireless intercepts finally revealed Spee's intent. The German squadron had set course for South American waters. Craddock's window to intercept them was rapidly closing, but his available force was woefully inadequate for the task. His flagship, HMS Good Hope, and the aging Monmouth carried mostly 6-inch guns, pea shooters against modern armored cruisers. Only Good Hope mounted 2 9.2-inch turrets. The light cruiser Glasgow offered speed and wireless capability, but little firepower. Otranto, an armed merchant cruiser, was practically decorative in a fleet action. A historian from the National Museum of the Royal Navy in Britain, Nick Hewitt, would later explain, quote, Craddock was in a difficult situation. He was going up against serious opposition. He knew his force was inadequate, and to make matters worse, he was getting bad direction from London. Worse still, the Admiralty's promises of reinforcement evaporated. HMS Defense, a modern armored cruiser with 4 twin 7.5-inch gun turrets, had diverted mid-voyage. Instead, Craddock received HMS Canopus, a pre-dreadnought battleship launched in 1899. Nominally armed with 4 12-inch main guns, Canopus hadn't seen action in years and desperately needed an overhaul. Her engines couldn't maintain more than 16 knots, far too slow to keep pace with Craddock's cruisers. Her presence would only anchor his mobility. Still, the Admiral insisted he, quote, be prepared to meet Spee in company. It was a message that offered no clear guidance. Craddock requested permission to split his forces, hoping to create a blocking position on both coasts of South America. Permission came, but communication lag and shifting decisions birthed further confusion. Defense was never rerouted west, and Craddock still waited on firm instructions about Canopus. As October closed, Churchill was too distracted by internal Admiralty politics to focus on Craddock's situation. When Craddock signaled on October 27th that he intended to leave the slow Canopus behind and hunt Spee directly, the message slipped through the cracks. Churchill didn't grasp the urgency or risk, and no one stepped in to tell Craddock to hold back and stay on the defensive. Meanwhile, Spee consolidated his force with ruthless efficiency. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, each carrying 8 8.2-inch guns, joined up with light cruisers Dresden, Leipzig, and Nuremberg. His crews were trained, confident, and disciplined. His squadron was compact, fast, and lethal. On October 31st, Craddock signaled his move to engage. He received Churchill's vague response the next day, offering no new orders and confirming HMS Defense would remain east. That night, Craddock read Churchill's note aboard Good Hope. He knew what was expected, and he wasn't going to wait for any further clarification. Clash at Coronel. At dawn on November 1st, 1914, Glasgow slipped out of Coronel Harbor with intercepted German signals in hand. Craddock, already steering northward, awaited her news. Heavy seas made coordination a nightmare, with messages passed by lines floated between rolling hulls. By midday, Craddock's squadron had formed into a search line, steaming north at 10 knots. They weren't hunting a single German cruiser anymore. They were sailing straight into Spee's main force. Late afternoon, at 4:17 p.m., Leipzig sighted smoke on the horizon. British cruisers. Spee accelerated to battle speed. Craddock's ships reversed course, heading south, with Glasgow and Otranto lagging behind. Craddock faced an impossible choice: abandon the merchant cruiser Otranto or stay and fight. He chose to stand. Spee waited patiently. With the sun setting behind the British squadron, he knew they'd be silhouetted against the horizon. Perfect targets. At 6:50 p.m., he moved to engage. Hewitt noted, quote, they were crack ships. Their crews had been together for years, and they knew exactly what they were doing. In contrast, Hewitt added, quote, the ships were old. The 2 armored cruisers were badly designed. All the odds were stacked against them. Scharnhorst opened fire at 12,000 yards. Her 8.2-inch shells found their mark almost immediately, one striking Good Hope's forward gun within minutes. The British secondary armament, casemate-mounted 6-inch guns, proved nearly useless in the pounding swell. Water flooded in every time they fired. Otranto turned away and fled the battle. Craddock tried desperately to close the range. By 7:30 p.m., his flagship, Good Hope, was within 6,000 yards. But the closer he drew, the more accurate Spee's fire became. Both Good Hope and Monmouth were ablaze. 20 minutes later, Good Hope's forward magazine detonated. She vanished in seconds. Scharnhorst shifted fire to Monmouth. Gneisenau joined the engagement, while the light cruisers targeted Glasgow. Her captain, realizing his ship stood no chance, ceased fire and withdrew. He passed the sinking Monmouth, but couldn't help. She was doomed. Just before 10 p.m., Nuremberg arrived late to find Monmouth still afloat, listing and refusing to strike her colors. Spee had no illusions. He gave the order. Monmouth vanished beneath the waves with all hands. Craddock was gone. Over 1,600 British sailors were lost. The Germans suffered no casualties. Spee, cautious of Canopus lurking somewhere nearby, turned north towards safety. Britain was stunned. A Royal Navy squadron had been annihilated. 2 armored cruisers lost, without inflicting serious damage. Craddock had followed orders, instinct, or both, straight into disaster. Spee had delivered a clean, calculated blow. Hewitt would later say, quote, "This was a superpower being humiliated. This sort of thing just didn't happen to the Royal Navy." But Spee failed to completely destroy Glasgow, and that meant London knew. The humiliation at Coronel would not go unanswered. Pride and hubris. On November 3, 1914, Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, and Nuremberg eased into Valparaiso harbor to raucous cheers from German expatriates. Admiral Maximilian von Spee remained on deck, stiff-backed, distant. When presented with a bouquet of flowers, Spee refused them, famously commenting, quote, "These will do nicely for my grave." He knew Coronel had cost half his stock of 8.2-inch shells, and he would not waste time on parades. 24 hours later, the squadron steamed for the Juan Fernandez anchorage, 350 nautical miles out. There, grim news confirmed Germany's overseas collapse. The light cruiser Emden destroyed, the German naval base at Tsingtao lost. With no base left in Asia and no reinforcements coming, Spee's squadron was stranded, cut off, outnumbered, and hunted. Meanwhile, on November 15th, Kaiser Wilhelm awarded 300 Iron Crosses to the squadron, with one first class to Spee himself, the ceremony completed on a remote beach at Bahia San Quintin. Once the ceremony subsided, Spee's captains urged a dash for home. Ammunition was thin, and coal was harder to find. Intelligence claimed that only elderly armored cruisers blocked the Atlantic route. Spee studied the charts and rejected withdrawal. He wanted one more strike to cripple British communications at Port Stanley before breaking north. At dawn on November 26th, the squadron rounded Cape Horn and anchored at Picton Island to strip coal from the captured collier Drumuir. On December 6th, stores topped and Drumuir scuttled. Spee signaled, quote, "Raid Falklands, destroy wireless, proceed Atlantic." Hewitt observed, quote, "It was all about merchant trade. The Germans were trying to disrupt British trade to hamper their war effort." With this final raid, Spee hoped to sever British communications in the South Atlantic before making his dash for home waters. Humiliation and vengeance. While Spee refueled, the British Admiralty burned with rage and humiliation. Hewitt pointed out that the Battle of Coronel, quote, had a genuinely catastrophic impact on British morale. First Sea Lord Sir John Fisher demanded swift and total retribution. He tapped Vice-Admiral Doubton Sturdy, former Chief of Staff and longtime rival, to command a hunter-destroyer group. The Vice-Admiral had spent over 40 years rising through the ranks, from torpedo specialist to trusted fleet commander. Though sidelined at times by politics and rivals like Admiral Fisher, he remained a sharp strategist and firm traditionalist. As the man supposedly responsible for advising on naval strategy and deployments, he was blamed for the debacle, faulted for the fatal mismatch that sent Craddock's outgunned squadron against Spee's superior force. Dismissed from the Admiralty in the aftermath, he became a convenient scapegoat for the chaos at the top. But he would be given a rare last chance. Churchill sent him south to hunt Spee. Embittered but resolute, Sturdy steamed for the South Atlantic, ready to restore Royal Navy honor at the Falklands. Fisher gave Sturdy overwhelming firepower, battlecruisers invincible and inflexible, each mounting 8 12-inch Mark 10 guns, capable of 27 knots. Armored cruisers Kent, Cornwall, and Carnarvon formed the second line. Light cruisers Glasgow and Bristol acted as scouts. Armed merchant Macedonia guarded the colliers. On November 11th, the battlecruisers slipped from Devonport, still under repair, civilian fitters hammering below decks. Coal consumption forced a 10-knot cruise, engines kept to half-stroke across the equator. At Camp Verde, rumors of their mission leaked ashore, but the news never reached Spee. On November 26th, Sturdy rendezvoused with Rear Admiral Stoddart at Abrolhos Rocks, top bunkers from collier SS Great Britain, and set course southwest. In his fighting instructions issued before leaving the Abrolhos Rocks, Sturdy had written that his light and armored cruisers should, quote, in the event of the enemy's light cruisers separating or attempting to escape, make it their business to deal with them. The trap was nearly sprung. The trap at Falklands. Spee's advance pair, Gneisenau and Nürnberg, approached Port Stanley, expecting nothing more than a tramp steamer and a wireless mast. Instead, 12-inch shells from the grounded pre-dreadnought Canopus straddled them at 13,000 yards. Beyond the ridge, tripod masts of two giants appeared, funnels belching black steam. Sturdy was raising pressure. Spee ordered engines to full ahead, turning east to gain sea room. Sturdy cleared the outer harbor, battle ensigns snapping aloft. They were finally inside of each other. Spee's squadron was outnumbered and had no clear path of escape, yet he pressed the attack. Kaiser Wilhelm's note on the official report would later read, quote, "It remains a mystery what made Spee attack the Falkland Islands." The answer was simple: bad timing, worse luck, and a stroke of British intelligence. In fact, there had been protests. 3 of Spee's captains had urged caution, but Valparaiso reported the port empty of warships, and the signal arrived via official German format, ciphered, clear, and convincing. Spee, still riding high after Coronel, chose to trust the system. But the signal wasn't theirs. Years later, a German naval officer would learn the truth from Admiral Hall of British Naval Intelligence. The message had been a fake, written in a broken German code and transmitted using a stolen telegraph form. It was bait, and Spee had taken it. If he had struck an hour earlier, he might have caught the British helpless at anchor, but Canopus bought Sturdy the time he needed. Now, Invincible and Inflexible were coming alive, crewmen scrambling to battle stations. Sturdy, calm and confident, had even ordered his men to eat breakfast before setting out. There would be a fight, but this time on British terms. Realizing the danger, Spee ordered retreat. His ships wheeled southeast, racing for open sea. At first, it seemed they might escape. He had a 15-mile head start, and every knot counted. But Spee knew the odds. His men were battle-hardened, but exhausted. Ammunition was low. His cruisers were slower, older, and outgunned. And behind them, Sturdy's modern capital ships were picking up speed, closing the gap with every mile. By 10:45 a.m., Spee's squadron had reformed. Scharnhorst at center, Gneisenau and Nürnberg ahead, Dresden and Leipzig trailing astern. But the British ships, Invincible and Inflexible, were already in pursuit. By 1 p.m., long-range British shells began to fall around the German squadron. At first, the shots were wild, overshooting or splashing astern. But not for long. The final stand. Spee could have continued running, gambling on distance. Instead, he made a final, fateful decision to turn and fight. He ordered Scharnhorst and Gneisenau to engage, giving his light cruisers, Leipzig, Nürnberg, and Dresden, a chance to break away. The big guns opened up just after 1:20 p.m. Smoke and wind conspired against the British, as the freshening breeze blew their funnel smoke across their line of sight. For a brief period, it seemed Spee's gamble might pay off. German salvos found their mark. Invincible was hit. Shells struck metal. Splinters tore through decks. But British armor held. Sturdy had no intention of breaking off. He kept closing the range, tightening the noose. The battlecruisers turned to bring their full broadsides to bear. Scharnhorst bucked under the pounding. Fire blossomed amidships. One of her funnels crumpled, then another. She began to list to port. Spee tried to shift position, maneuvering to bring all guns into play, but by now it was too late. At 4 p.m., Scharnhorst's list had grown severe. Ammunition fires spread below decks. Men were blown overboard or consumed by flames. Scharnhorst shuddered, her decks awash, her guns falling apart. 13 minutes later, the bow plunged. The stern lifted, hesitated, then slipped beneath the surface. No lifeboats launched. Admiral Spee remained on the bridge to the end. His last message to Gneisenau was calm, final. Save yourself. Gneisenau fought on. She weaved, returned fire, and evaded as best she could. Sturdy pressed his advantage, hammering her with Invincible, Inflexible, and the armored cruiser Carnarvon. Gneisenau's hull shattered. superstructure burning, but she refused to surrender. At 5:15 p.m., her last shells were fired. Still, she stayed afloat for nearly another hour, drifting and burning. Soon after, she finally slipped beneath the surface. British boats picked up 190 survivors from the freezing water. Farther west, the running fights continued. Nürnberg tried to flee, but the aged British cruiser Kent closed in. Engines driven beyond their limits, the Germans struggled with failing boilers. At 5:30 p.m., Nürnberg turned to fight. Her fire was steady, but her shells lacked punch. 2 boiler explosions crippled her mobility. Just under 2 hours later, after a desperate battle, she capsized and went under. Meanwhile, Leipzig was hunted down by Glasgow and Cornwall. Though she managed to hold off the faster cruisers for hours, her ammunition ran out. Still, she flew her battle ensign. Still, she fought. Not until distress flares were fired did Glasgow cease fire. But it was over. At 9:23 p.m., Leipzig rolled and vanished beneath the waves. Only 18 men survived. The Germans left nearly 1,900 men behind in the cold South Atlantic, lost with their guns or pulled from the water in silence. Another 215 were taken prisoner. On the British side, 10 men had fallen, 19 more wounded. Their ships bore the scars, but the fleet had held. Lloyd Hurst, assistant paymaster in HMS Glasgow, would later write, quote, "The dignified memorial service in Port Stanley Cathedral, and the sight of 4 boy buglers of Invincible, with tears streaming down their cheeks, blowing the last post over the graves of their comrades, are imperishable memories." The squadron's fate. Earlier in the engagement, while Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were facing Sturdy's battlecruisers, Dresden broke away, her turbines screaming as she pulled east, a slim gray streak on the horizon. Glasgow's captain, the senior officer pursuing the light cruisers, signaled, quote, "I fear I'm only gaining slowly on the Dresden. Having already engaged Leipzig, I feel I must stand by you." The last German cruiser would try to slip away, for now. With superior speed and a head start, Dresden disappeared before the British could adjust their sights. By the time Scharnhorst was ablaze and Gneisenau's crew were abandoning ship, Dresden was already miles away, rounding Tierra del Fuego and racing into the Pacific. Sturdy knew one had escaped. His cruisers scoured the channels and islands to no avail. Dresden had vanished into the labyrinth of fjords around Cape Horn. On December 9th, she passed the Horn again under the cover of foul weather, coal stocks nearly gone. At Shoal Bay, she took on what little fuel she could find and made for Punta Arenas. The German Admiralty clung to hope. Maybe Dresden could break out across the Pacific or reach German East Africa. But her engines were failing, patched with salt-crusted canvas and jury-rigged valves. Her captain knew his ship wouldn't survive a chase for long. Still, Dresden persisted. On February 14th, she left South America, captured one merchant near Masa Tierra, and then headed to the Juan Fernandez Islands for coal. 6 days later, British wireless intercepts, decoded by naval intelligence, had pinpointed Dresden's coaling rendezvous. As Royal Navy cruisers closed in, Dresden ran westward at full speed, but her bunkers were nearly empty. With steam pressure dropping and no escape route left, her captain veered south and limped toward the remote Chilean island of Masafuera. In the calm waters of the island's Cumberland Bay, Dresden dropped anchor and raised a white flag, requesting internment. The Royal Navy arrived the next day. The last chase of the East Asia Squadron had ended, but fragments of the squadron's story kept resurfacing. In mid-1915, a German sailor's body washed ashore in Brazil. Tied to him was a waterproof cartridge case containing one of Scharnhorst's war flags. It was returned to Germany and displayed in Berlin until it was lost during the next war. In 2019, after over a century, Scharnhorst's wreck was found upright on the seabed southeast of the Falklands. Much of her superstructure was gone, but the hull still sat intact. In the gathering twilight of December 8th, the wreckage of Spee's hopes drifted across the South Atlantic. 5 ships were lost, nearly 2,000 men gone. His squadron, which had once evaded the Royal Navy across half the globe and humiliated them at Coronel, had been annihilated. Hurst wrote, quote, "Thus, in a summary and complete manner, was Coronel avenged."